For years, famously over-the-top North Korean newsreader Ri Chun-hee used the whole variety of Korean adjectives to exclaim the wonders of North Korea, the infallibility of its ruling Kim family, and the evil nature of the United States of America. For 75 years after the start of the Korean War, the North Korean people, led first by Kim Il-sung, then his son Kim Jong-il, and now Kim Jong-un, have had three purposes in life: to love the Kim dynasty, to hate the United States, and to defend the homeland from it. 75 years later, the US and North Korea, along with American ally South Korea, are painted in North Korean government propaganda as being ready to send hundreds of thousands of bloodthirsty troops over the 38th parallel to destroy the workers' paradise that is the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, the DPRK. The ironic thing is that, with the possible exception of the time when an American Navy ship, the Pueblo, drifted into North Korean waters while on an intelligence mission, the U.S. military has had no intention of attacking the North. None. Not even during the height of the Cold War in the late 1970s. To the North Koreans, their country is a communist utopia. At least that's what is said in public. Though by 2025, many North Koreans secretly know it is not. To the Americans, North Korea was and is a problem, especially after it developed nuclear weapons. Still, it's not a country the U.S. has ever given serious thought to invading since the end of the war in 1953. The North Korean regime has been ranting against the United States for 75 years because, from 1950 to 53, the USA dropped more explosive tonnage on North Korea than it did in the entire Pacific War, including the bombing of Japan. Yes, you heard that right. North Korea was bombed more heavily than the Japanese were throughout the Pacific War. An estimated 503,000 tons of bombs were dropped in the Pacific Theater. About 185,000 tons were dropped on Japan itself. During the 3 years of the Korean conflict, the United States dropped an estimated 635,000 tons of bombs on North Korea alone, and twice as much napalm. In the 1940s, Japan was a major industrial power, and most of its population was urban. The casualties were staggering, upward of 500,000 people, and that's not counting the dropping of the A-bombs in August 1945. In the 3 years of the Korean War, experts from the USA, South Korea, and the Soviet Union put the death toll from bombing at just under 300,000. But as a total of the population, the death toll in North Korea from US bombing took a far greater toll. Japan lost about 1% of its pre-war population. The North Koreans lost anywhere between 12 to 15% of their total pre-war population. In the United States, the Korean War is often called the Forgotten War, coming between the global conflict of World War II and the many and more controversial battles of the later Cold War, like the Vietnam War. But in the 2.5 years of U.S. boots on the ground in Korea, nearly 40,000 men were killed, in contrast to the 50,000 lost in the 10 years of Vietnam. For those who fought through and survived it on both sides, the Korean War is hardly forgotten. Wars create two types of memory: the collective kind, entire nations bombed, cities turned to ash, hundreds of thousands dead. Those memories get passed down through generations, kept alive by governments and history books. Then there are the individual memories, the single soldier who made one impossible choice. Those disappear unless someone keeps them alive. That's why we started Project Dog Tag. We refuse to let the most courageous acts in our history fade into nothing. Our first drop commemorates Lieutenant John R. Fox. In 1944, he called in an artillery strike on his own coordinates. His position in an Italian village was being overrun. Enemy forces closing in, his men trapped. Fox grabbed the radio and gave the order that would kill him because it was the only way to save his soldiers and stop the advance. He didn't hold the line, he became it. We're making only 500 pieces. Each piece serves as a personal monument, a commitment to wear Fox's name, tell his story, and refuse to let his sacrifice become a forgotten statistic. And because remembrance means action, we're donating $5 from every piece to veteran support organizations. We'll share exactly where these funds go, and provide regular updates on our impact. On November 24th, we're opening this to a limited group who want to be a part of this movement. Join the waitlist to secure your spot and get 35% off as an early member. Link below. In 1950, the Korean Peninsula was a backward and impoverished region. 35 years of harsh Japanese colonial rule had taken a toll. In the 5 or so years since the end of World War II, the Korean people were divided, not only geographically, but politically as well. When World War II ended, the Soviet Union and the United States agreed to split the Korean Peninsula. The North would be under the Soviet sphere and communist, and the South under the American sphere. Although the entire country was impoverished in 1950, the North was the poorer, more agrarian half, as well as the far more sparsely populated. Throughout the World War II years, the Soviets backed communist leader Kim Il-sung, who worshipped Stalin like a god. Kim was a hardcore communist, who later would come to believe that both the Soviets and the Chinese communists under Mao Zedong were soft, who were on the wrong path toward communism. But in 1950, he hoped that Stalin and Mao would give the okay for his invasion of the South and attempt to unite all Koreans in a communist People's Republic. Initially, North Korean forces poured down into South Korea and pinned US, UN, and South Korean troops into the Pusan perimeter. At the same time, they built their strength elsewhere. And elsewhere came in the form of the Incheon invasion on the central east coast of South Korea on September 15, 1950. Initially, the North Koreans held significant advantages. They had more men and tanks, and they enjoyed the element of surprise. However, they lacked air superiority. The United States didn't. Although there was still a long way to go, World War II had proven that air power would be the decisive factor in any future wars. Though the US had no intention, at least at first, to drop another nuclear weapon, it did have one thing in its arsenal that the Soviets and their North Korean allies could barely imagine: strategic bombing. By the end of World War II, the men in charge of the US Air Force had thousands of bombers at their disposal, the most powerful of which was the B-29 superfortress of Hiroshima and Nagasaki fame. By the time the Korean War began, the US still had hundreds of B-29s and other bombers in its arsenal, despite starting to phase them out for newer models. When the Korean War began, the North Korean Air Force consisted of a few dozen old World War II Soviet planes, none of which were able to reach the heights flown by the B-29s. And it was in the air that the US and its UN allies had a very distinct advantage. Not only did they have the equipment, but they had the experience needed to begin and sustain a long campaign. Starting with the North's invasion of the South, U.S. planes flying from Japan and aircraft carriers off the Korean coast began to interrupt North Korean supplies and movement behind the lines to slow their rapid advance. Actually, the first destruction by air came in the South, where the communist North Koreans were racing down the peninsula toward their goal of unifying the Korean peninsula under communist rule. Southern bridges, railways, the few paved roads and highways that existed, train stations, and more were all U.S. targets. By the day of the Americans landing behind North Korean lines at Incheon in September, the front lines in Korea had stabilized for a time, and American and UN, primarily British air forces, put together an organized bombing campaign of the North. One of the things the American public has heard since World War II is that our bombing campaigns have been pinpoint accurate. Nothing could be further from the truth. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey, which did extensive research on the bombing of Japan and Germany during the war, concluded that most bombs missed their intended targets, usually by hundreds of yards. An estimated 20% of bombs missed their targets by more than 1,000 yards. The same conclusion was reached during Vietnam, when the U.S. Air Force dropped more explosives on that small country than in all of World War II and still failed to achieve its aims. In both Gulf Wars, it was widely acknowledged that even with a marked improvement in accuracy since 1945, most bombs dropped on Iraq missed their targets, at least by a wider margin of safety than was being claimed by U.S. authorities. At the end of World War II, photos and accounts of the firebombing and atomic bombings of Germany and Japan had forced many Americans to pass the rage they felt at Japan and Hitler for bringing them into the war and look at what their air forces had done. Virtually no one said that it should never have happened, but there were undoubtedly more voices calling out for caution than there had been before the end of the war. Though the idea of sparing communist troops as they took over South Korea was not something most people in 1950 were willing to consider, more and more people were concerned that, as in World War II, civilians would bear the brunt of the violence and bombing. In response, the Air Force made many announcements during the war about the improvements that had been made in bombing accuracy since 1945, and that, even more than in World War II, bombardiers would be able to put their bombs in a pickle barrel, in other words, onto a small target. That may or may not have been the intention, but high-level strategic bombing in the Korean War at least was no better in 1950 than it had been 5 years before. Nevertheless, despite knowing the truth, the authorities continued to announce improvements in U.S. bombing accuracy. The fact of the matter is that the few cities of North Korea were easy targets. Most of them were mostly made from wood. Most were undefended, at least for the first months of the war. And to be honest, after the first months of the war, most of the cities in North Korea were in ruins. And lastly, many of the town's cities located in the mountains were supplied by rail. That meant that large-scale carpet bombing was unlikely, but that U.S. planes following and bombing railways would follow them over and into cities to drop the last great tactical weapon of World War II on wooden North Korean cities, towns, and villages: napalm. Napalm is a thickened gasoline turned into a burning gel. Unlike regular fuel, it sticks to whatever it touches: people, animals, buildings, plants, and burns at high temperatures for a prolonged period. When it's dropped by plane as a bomb or sprayed and ignited, napalm spreads fire over a wide area. Chemical burns that are difficult to put out, as well as suffocate, are two of the horrible ways that napalm kills people. On top of the actual horror of napalm is the fear of it. It's not only a tactical weapon, it's a psychological one. By November 1950, UN troops had pushed North Korean forces back to the Korean border with China. For weeks, China had been issuing warnings to the U.S. to stay away from the border, but the warnings were dismissed. When 250,000 Chinese troops came pouring over the border in late November, though, it was the U.S. Air Force, along with U.S. naval aviation, that helped slow down their advance, at least until UN troops rallied along the 38th parallel, where the border of the Koreas is today. As the Chinese moved southward, the U.S. deployed most of its bomber strength in Asia to destroy 75% of Pyongyang, North Korea's capital, 80% of the vital port of Hamhung, 95% of the city of Sariwon, and all of the port town of Wonsan and the rail city of Sinanju was obliterated, burned out. What that meant for the people of those cities was this: thousands were incinerated as they tried to escape. After the raids, some people seemed untouched, but were dead. All of the oxygen had been taken from their bodies when napalm was ignited nearby. Entire neighborhoods were nothing but gasoline-soaked ash. And throughout were piles of bodies and wounded. One of World War II's most infamous men, General Curtis LeMay, who was head of the Strategic Air Command and had commanded the bombing campaign over Japan in World War II, said this about North Korea: "Over a period of 3 years or so, we killed off, 20% of the population?" And Dean Rusk, a Defense Department official who would later be Secretary of State, said, "We were bombing everything that moved in North Korea, every brick on top of another." No one is arguing that the North Korean regime, then or now, has been one of the most horrific nightmares of the last 80 years. But that doesn't change the fact that, then or now, the North Korean people have had virtually no choice in what happens to them, in their lives. And so, in 1950, hundreds of thousands of North Koreans were killed over 3 years, about 6 to 7% of the entire country. In 1950, the United States had a population of about 151 million people. 6 to 7% of that would be about 9 million people, or the entire population of New York City. Making things worse was the fact that North Korea was at war, and what medicine there was went to the front line, making the infection and sickness rate among civilians even worse. Adding to the misery was the destruction of dams and water supply systems that not only brought thirst, but caused disease, and again, there was very little medical care available. In 1952, after more than a year of stalemate along the 38th parallel, the U.S. began a program of targeting the North's hydroelectric grid. Repeatedly hitting the Sui-Ho Dam complex meant that all electricity, and therefore power to pump water as well, was knocked out for weeks at a time, leaving most of the country in darkness. The following year, the Americans moved on to dams, blowing them apart and causing widespread flooding, which not only damaged infrastructure, but also destroyed crops, and hunger was already a huge factor in the war. Strategically, the Americans were trying to make the war too expensive for the Chinese and North Koreans to support, and they were winning. In the US, Korea was overshadowed by World War II before it and Vietnam after it. Americans of the time remember Incheon and the Pusan perimeter. Still, the bombing remains obscure, mainly because it seemed to pale in comparison with what had happened in World War II, especially the explosion of the atomic bomb. The US government also tried to hide the scale of the bombing with terms like precision, so the American public would be more accepting of the bombing. Still, those in power knew hundreds of thousands of North Koreans had been killed, and that the US would continue to use weapons like napalm far into the future. Within a few weeks of the bombing campaign over Korea, the North Koreans and their Soviet and Chinese allies realized that without direct help in the air, North Korea did not have a chance. Within weeks, Soviet pilots in their new and excellent MiG-15 jet fighters were beginning to knock B-29s out of the sky, which no one saw coming. As a result, the B-29, which had seemed invincible during World War II and the first few weeks of Korea, was knocked out of the daylight skies over Korea and began an equally terrifying and perhaps more random campaign of nighttime bombing. Sadly, it's mainly American veterans, their families, and historians who remember the Korean War today. Most Americans have some vague understanding of a war that took place many years ago, but the only real memory they have of it is the TV show MASH or the weird news reports that occasionally come out of North Korea. For the North Koreans, however, the bombing of their country is one of the more central events of their nation's history. In other words, it's the North Korean equivalent of the Battle of Bunker Hill. And we haven't stopped talking about that for over 250 years. Put that way, the North Korean news is relatively current.